The Center of the Cyclone. And this is a continuation of Chapter 5. I thank the Cornell wrestler and Steve for a very profound change in my deepest nature. During this week, I saw many profound changes in many people. For example, there was the little housewife from Florida in her first encounter group. She was Catholic and had 5 children, was 45 years old, and turned out to be very talented in a very special region of human activity. She could go into trance automatically. I discovered this in the middle of an encounter group in which somebody became extremely angry with her, and she sat there in the middle of the floor, unmoving, and kind of disappeared. Her body was there, but obviously her mind wasn't. I immediately picked up the fact that she went into trance when frightened. Steve had us get together in dyads, and it says in brackets, twosomes, outside the hours for group work. And in the next dyad encounter with her, I asked her if she knew what she was doing. She described it very accurately. She said that when she gets frightened, she goes down inside into a very small gray place by means of looking at any bright object across the room. She fixes her gaze on the bright object and then jumps out of her body and into this very small gray space. I found this a very fascinating maneuver, and I asked her if she could reproduce it for me. She tried, but she couldn't do it. I said, apparently, you have to be frightened to do this. That was the clue. I managed to get her frightened enough so that she could do it. And while she was in trance, I suggested that there were other ways of handling her fear and her anger. I talked to her in her little gray place. She trusted me. We arranged for a set of steps out of the little gray place. 10 steps rather than one big jump. I said, as you come out of your trance, you will move up the steps toward the usual consensus reality. And on the way, you will take a trip into the universe, and you will find out what's on all of these other steps. She agreed to do and started up. She stayed out of her body and traveled out into the universe, came back onto this planet, came back into the baths and into her body. We repeated this several times, and she walked down the steps and came back up the steps several times. This all took about 3 days. On the 4th day back with the encounter group, she allowed herself to become very angry at a great big man who was very sophisticated in encounter and hence wasn't moving at all. She decided that he was going to move. She worked up her rage. She ran across the room and butted him in the stomach with her head, knocking him flat. She then proceeded to stay with him and to comfort him, to care for him, and to work like a Trojan with the rest of the group in getting him to move. This was a really fantastic advance for her, to be able to ride on her fear energy and her anger energy and then do effective work with a person rather than jumping into trance and leaving her body. During that week, we discovered 2 other people who were doing similar kinds of things in threatening situations. Apparently, to go into trance to escape the consequences of going outside is a fairly... No, let me read the sentence again. Apparently, to go into trance to escape the consequences of what's going on outside is a fairly common civilized reaction to rage or fear. The week following the Stroud encounter group, I was in a Fritz Perlman's weekend and a week-long workshop of Gestalt therapy. Fritz was the originator and the old master of Gestalt therapy. The group that he was working with sat around the sides of the room in chairs. Beside him there was a chair called the hot seat. If one wanted to work with him, one had to get into the hot seat beside Fritz. I watched some of the more experienced people get into the hot seat, and I watched what happened once they were there before I tried it myself. I began to see that one dived into painful or other negative places that one did not like to enter, and let Fritz do the programming once one was into the emotional space. This was my version at the time of the basis for working with Fritz. The first thing that I wanted to work on was a problem that I had had continually most of my professional life, what is called me and my audience. In this mode of operation of my biocomputer, I was in the middle of a group inside my head. I spoke to this group, my audience, and expected them to react in a certain way. I carried out what I later called a TV script having to do with my audience. This, to me, was a time-wasting and energy-wasting game that I was playing inside my own head. When I got into the hot seat, I told Fritz this was my problem. And he said, "All right, put your audience in that chair, and you stay in your own chair. Now, talk to your audience." I said, "Why are you always there? Why do you bother me? Why do you sit there watching and listening? Why don't I get any responses from you? Why don't I get the responses I want and need from you? Are you real? What do I need you for? Go away. I am angry with you." Fritz said, "Okay. Now, get into the other chair and be the audience and tell John what you're thinking of him." So, as the audience, I said, "You are a posturing fool. You stand up there and lecture us. You tell us what makes the world go around. You tell us what makes you operate. You are such a great analyzer, and yet, here we are. Here we sit, watching all of this, criticizing you, and you really don't know what this is all about. You are an egotistical, fanatical playing the game of science, whereas you really don't know what's happening. You can't understand us. You can't understand why we're in your head. You don't even know how to get rid of us." Fritz said, "Okay, shift." So I got into my own chair and became John again. By this time I was very angry as John, and I said to the audience, "God damn you, I've had enough of your back talk. You guys are really in disguise. I know what you're doing. You are splitting me up into tiny control system." And then I shouted, "Fuck you." And Fritz said, "Do to the audience what you would like to do to the audience." And I raised my hands up over my head. I made fists and I came down on the barrel. That was the audience, and I smashed the top of it with a great deal of satisfaction and rage. Fritz watched all this and he said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "Great." He said, "Now go around to the group and tell each one what you would really like to tell each one of them." I did so, giving each one a very personal message, very much to the point about our relationship. This completely cleaned me out in regard to the audience for a while. A few days later, I got into the hot seat again, and this time about the death of my mother. I had some unfinished business, which caused a continuous tape loop having to do with guilt about her death. To rotate below my levels of awareness, I had spent 7 years working to keep her alive, and then at the end, when the cancer finally killed her through a respiratory death, I blamed myself for having kept her alive by artificial means for so long. I got into the hot seat, and Fritz said, "Okay, go back to your mother's death." I went back to that particular day, and I began to hear her dying, became frightened, and came back to the group. Fritz said, "Go back." I went back again, and I started going through the fear, the grief, and the guilt connected with the doctors and with my own part in it. I examined very carefully the whole tape having to do with her death. I cried. I became extremely fearful, got into panic. Then I cried with grief again. 3 times Fritz put me through it, and finally he said, "Okay, you haven't quite finished, but you've dealt with most of it." He let me off the hot seat. I spent a total of 2 weeks and 1 weekend in his workshops and learned very much about myself and about others and about his technique. I was impressed with the fact that he could tune in on where one was and then program one to move even further into the space that one was reluctant to go into. I found that as long as one was willing to allow him to program one and to go ahead with whatever it was, then Fritz was happy and one made progress. I was next exposed to Ida Rolf for a week. I received my first 3 hours of what is called Rolfing. Ida worked out over a 40-year period a technique of working on deep muscles, the fascia, and the joints in such a way that structural integration is restored to one's body. One stands, walks, and does other things correctly, the way one did as a child, before trauma spoiled the line of the body. Ida frees up the body by stretching the fascia around the muscles. This leads to pain if one resists what she is doing, or if the muscles themselves resist what she is doing. During the first hour when she was working on my chest, I was resisting and experiencing intense pain. I saw her as a witch with a tall black hat and fangs, and I told her this, and she said, "I am merely a nice little gray-haired old lady. The pain is yours. I am not causing the pain. You are." During that week, I learned how one can tie up energy in muscle postures and hold the body in certain definite attitudes as a result of previous trauma in childhood, which function with brain feedback repeating like tape loops for years. For example, she was working on my left shoulder, and suddenly I saw myself at 2.5, dragged across the lawn by my favorite collie dog, who had his teeth gripping my left shoulder. I was in panic and rage until I had a sense of being betrayed by my favorite dog. Suddenly, as an adult, I could see more of the scene, and I saw the dog had been dragging me away from a wall that I had been about to fall over. Suddenly, I was able to forgive the dog and accept the pain. And as she continued to work on the shoulder, there was no more pain. Thus, I realized that the human biocomputer includes the muscle systems, and the way these are held by the central nervous system patterns of activity is a function of fixation in childhood. Trauma causes hiding of the causes of the trauma, thus setting up a tape loop in the central nervous system, which goes on perpetually activated until broken into either at the pain end or the muscle end. When Ida goes into such an area, she finds the muscles that are tense and presses on them very strongly, stretching the fascia. This causes pain, which then reorganizes the central nervous system for that area, thus breaking the loop. It was with an intense sense of relief that I gave up the tension in that left shoulder, tension that I did not even know that I had. Ida showed that she had an eye, a sensitive pattern recognition system for such evidences of trauma. She could look at somebody's body and feel it and tell immediately where these spots were and where these systems were. I suddenly began to realize that one did not have to go down into old age and become arthritic, that with Rolfing, one could stay youthful. At that time, Fritz Perls, at 75, had had 50 hours. At that time, at 75, Fritz Perls had had 50 hours of Rolfing and showed it in his youthful bouncy step. Through Rolfing, I also discovered some other important properties of the human biocomputer. When I was 21, I was in the woods near Klamath Falls, Oregon, working on a survey crew. I was the chief brush cutter. In cutting a path for the survey crew through the swamp, the axe had slipped on a wet root in the swamp and had gone into my foot, cutting it deeply. I didn't know that I had cut myself. I thought that I had cut the little dog that belonged to the head of the survey crew. When I saw the blood spurting out from the leaves below, I couldn't see my own foot. There was no pain, but suddenly I realized that I had cut myself. I lay down and I raised my leg up in the air, and I shouted for the survey crew. They came and they took me off to the hospital, where the doctor sewed and cut from the bottom up in multiple layers. It became infected, and I had to spend 12 days in the hospital. During the week of the Rolfing, Peter Melchior, Melchior, had started to work on my feet and came across the scar. I warned him that this was a peculiar place on my foot where the nerve fibers grew in peculiar fashion, and it was extremely sensitive. He said, okay, and approached it rather carefully. We were working in a room high on the cliff above Pacific Ocean. At the instant that he started to put his fingers through the scar on my foot, a jet plane came by the cliff. The noise of the jet went from my foot to my head at the instant he traveled through the scar, so there was fantastic energy release from the scar. The noise of the jet ran that energy from my foot all the way to my head and out the top of my head. During this, I saw the axe descending over my foot and very slowly cutting the skin, the first layer of subcutaneous tissue, the fascia, the ligaments, and going down into the bone. This time, I felt the pain of the entrance of the axe, which was missing in the original happening. And as he continued to work on it, I also felt the pain of the surgeon stitching it up. Peter reported that he thought I had made the noise, not a jet. Suddenly, I realized that I had blocked the pain in the original experience. This scar had held the potential of that pain ever since. It also had a basic traumatic memory, a tape loop attached to it. I had favored that foot, favored that region of the foot, and had not completed the hole that was left in my body image here. The Rolfing showed me this hole to fill in, allowing my posture to improve in respect to that foot, and the realization of the pain passed away. In the midst of these rather intensive workshops that I was taking from others, I gave a weekend workshop of my own. This was my first experience with the workshop way of presenting material to a group. There were 2-hour sessions scheduled Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Saturday night, and Sunday morning. My previous experience had been with lectures rather than workshops. The difference lies in the fact that in a workshop, one participates with the audience. The audience is on the same level with the leader, and it expects direct experience rather than being lectured at. Before the workshop started, I had had lots of doubts and fears about my ability to do this. It was all very new to me, and it was a very large change from participant to leader. I had been very busy at Esalen, changing my whole life attitude toward my previous life, and dropping my previous identity insofar as I could do this. When I was approached at Esalen as the John Lilly, who had worked with dolphins, I found this to be a downer, and I resented the interruption of my change of identity by bringing up an older identity. The scheduled workshop was on us and dolphins, thereby reinvigorating that old image with which I currently was uncomfortable. In the first session, I told the participants that I would give a lecture and that I would answer questions about dolphins only on the Friday night. The rest of the sessions would be devoted to their finding out by first-hand experience what it is to be a dolphin, insofar as they were capable of doing this. One participant, a psychiatrist from Los Angeles, objected to this strenuously, saying he did not expect this weekend was going to be an encounter. I said, let's wait and see. He did stay. The first evening I gave a lecture about dolphins with audience questions interspersed. As I promised, the rest of the workshop was devoted to first-hand experience as to what it would be like to be a dolphin. I pointed out that human beings are land animals, featherless bipeds with hands who wear clothes and make things and who cannot swim very fast. For a human to appreciate the position of the dolphin at sea, he must understand their breathing programs and the necessity of having only a voluntary respiration when in the sea. This fact alone makes each dolphin dependent upon all other dolphins. There is a mutual interdependence which is far greater than it is between human beings. If a dolphin, for any reason, becomes unconscious, he stops breathing and sinks. His only chance of survival is for his fellow dolphins to bring him to the surface and to wake him up. In the workshop, I showed that in order to be like a dolphin, the members of the workshop must depend totally on one another. They must love one another, play with one another, and experience the dangers of swimming in water with one another. In one session, we used the baths at Esalen to illustrate the points. Each member of the workshop participating in this exercise hyperventilated until his consciousness changed while in the warm water. While he did this, he was watched over by another member of the workshop, and as he began to have various experiences because of the hyperventilation, he was aided by the other member in various ways, including being prevented from sinking. Each one took turns in this exercise. Previous to this exercise, I had told them on dry land how to breathe like a dolphin. This is a good method of breathing for meditation. One lies on one's back and one blows all the air out of one's lungs and fills them to the fullest capacity and holds one's breath for as long as one can. This quiets the respiration and allows one to do a meditation free of the respiratory movements. When one can't hold the air any longer, one blows all the air out very fast and sucks it in again very fast in a very impulsive, short fashion. Practice of this on dry land is necessary before doing it in water. In the tanks, the participants lie on their backs and breathe in this way, and as soon as one fills one's lungs completely, one is floating on the air in the lungs. As one begins to run out of oxygen and the carbon dioxide accumulates, one blows all the air out as far as he can very rapidly and pulls the air in before one can sink. It is the rapid emptying and the filling which prevent the body from sinking. One is non-buoyant for such a brief period of time that one doesn't have time to sink. This is a very good safety maneuver if one is caught in the water after falling overboard for any reason. One can relax this way and recover one's strength and decide what one is going to do. Could be an excellent life-saving procedure. One can close one's eyes, do this maneuver in the tank, and do an in-the-water meditation very much as one does in the physical isolation tank. Since there is water in one's ear against the eardrum, the sound intensity is very much reduced. If one clasps one's hands under the neck so that the elbows are out of the water, this assures not tipping over to the side. In water 19 inches deep, one keeps one's feet on the bottom of the pool with the knees bent and the rest of the body straight. This is needed in fresh water, as the lower body is not as buoyant and cannot support the feet and legs. However, in salt water, like the sea or that in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, there is a high enough buoyancy so that this isn't needed and one can float at the surface totally. With this kind of meditation position, one can really float off out of one's body into various kinds of inner space maneuvers that one cannot do without it, at least at the beginning. It is a very fast doorway to get into the floating inner spaces. This is a technique that I used in St. Thomas in the tank using LSD in 1964 to 66. Working with this technique at Esalen without LSD, I was able to return into many of the spaces that I had achieved earlier. Several of the participants in the workshops moved into new spaces very rapidly. Some of the more talented persons who were capable of entering trance did so and achieved very far-out experiences. We had to insist that people do not do this in the tanks without another participant or a staff member being present. Mounting enthusiasm could easily have led to an accident. It is an underwritten law at Esalen that each participant that comes there takes responsibility for himself, for his own safety, and does not do things that he doesn't feel capable of doing. This is a necessary point of view to have, since one is pushing oneself way beyond one's usual limits and taking risks that one doesn't normally take. It is absolutely necessary that one assume the responsibility for one's ability to take these risks. Fritz called it responsibility. I had been through some of this risk-taking myself, and I asked the participants in this workshop to do the same. Other aspects of the workshop touched upon were that the dolphins were close, that they had a freely moving and joyful life, constantly together, and that they had no compunctions about bowel movements, urination, or their sex life. I intimated that humans could well afford to try this way of living. Some people had successfully achieved this with a good deal more of divine objective love in their relationships and with that sort of dispassionate directness that one found among the dolphins. If we could love one another, whether the person liked it or not, I felt that we could get farther along on our spiritual trip. Today, I still feel that by emulation of the dolphins' ways, we could make a lot faster progress in loving one another and in enjoying life and abolishing the tensions that go on between groups of people. I hope that during the next 10 years we can achieve this. When we begin to get enough people into this space, then maybe we'll be ready to return to the dolphins. Several of the staff at Esalen were in the workshop and later expressed their enthusiasm for what had been presented and for what they had experienced. Most of my fears were abolished as the workshop progressed. I saw how much people really wanted to know about dolphins and about themselves. From that point on, I had no more problems being a leader of workshops, at least no problems within myself. I began to see the ways and means of having people experience new and novel experiences with a new format. I presented the human biocomputer set of concepts and ways of dealing with oneself as an aid to navigating inner space. In that first workshop, I saw a great potentiality for presenting that point of view in future workshops.